In June 1942, a Japanese aircraft carrier named Kaga sailed into one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific War. It never came home. At Midway, Kaga was lost alongside Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, four carriers from the main Japanese strike force that were destroyed during the battle. Today, the wreck of the original Kaga rests roughly 5,400 meters beneath the Pacific. But the name did not disappear. 8 decades later, another Japanese warship carries it, J.S. Kaga. And once again, there are fighter aircraft on its flight deck. But almost everything else has changed. The original Kaga served the Imperial Japanese Navy during a war of expansion. The modern Kaga serves Japan's maritime self-defense force inside a post-war defense system built around deterrence, territorial defense, and the alliance with the United States. The name returned. The Navy around it did not. And that historical contrast is only the beginning of this story. Because officially, Japan still does not classify the modern Kaga as an aircraft carrier. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force lists Kaga as DDH-184, part of the Izumo-class of large helicopter-carrying destroyers. Its sister ship, Izumo, is DDH-183. The ships are about 248 meters long, with a standard displacement of roughly 20,000 tons. Large by destroyer standards, but nowhere close to the size of an American supercarrier, and much smaller than China's newest carrier, Fujian. So calling Kaga a mega carrier misses what makes the ship interesting. Kaga matters precisely because Japan is gaining carrier-like aviation capability without building a traditional supercarrier. And in 2024, that transition became impossible to ignore. Off the coast of California, Kaga underwent developmental testing with F-35B fighters. Aircraft performed short takeoffs from the flight deck. They returned using vertical landings. Crews practiced the basic shipboard operations required to support the aircraft. The tests were not a theoretical exercise. They demonstrated that Kaga's modifications were moving toward a real operational capability. Japan still officially calls the ship a destroyer, but its flight deck has now been tested with F-35Bs. The label stayed familiar. The capability changed. And that raises a much more important question. Why does Japan want fighter aviation back at sea after roughly 8 decades? The answer begins with geography. Japan is an island nation surrounded by an enormous maritime area. And its territory does not end with the 4 main home islands. To the southwest, a long chain of islands stretches from Kyushu toward Taiwan. The Nansei, or Ryukyu, island chain extends across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. Farther along that strategic geography sit the Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan and also claimed by China and Taiwan. The wider region forms part of what strategists commonly describe as the first island chain. That chain influences access between the East Asian mainland and the wider Western Pacific. Japan occupies a strategically important section of it, and that creates a basic problem. Fixed air bases are extremely valuable. They have long runways, large maintenance facilities, fuel, weapons storage, repair capacity, and everything else modern combat aircraft require. But a fixed airbase has one obvious limitation. It cannot move. A flight deck can. Kaga does not replace Japan's land-based air power. Neither does Izumo. But ships capable of supporting F-35Bs give Japan another place from which tactical aircraft may operate. That extra option is the point. It provides flexibility across a maritime environment where distances are large and where Japan has been strengthening defenses around its southwestern islands. And the timing of this change is not happening in isolation. Across the region, China's naval aviation capability has also been expanding. China now has 3 aircraft carriers. Its newest is Fujian. Commissioned in November 2025, Fujian represents a major step beyond China's first 2 carriers. It is much larger than Kaga. It uses electromagnetic catapults. And during testing, aircraft associated with China's next generation of carrier aviation have operated from the ship, including the J-35 stealth fighter and the KJ-600 airborne early warning aircraft. But Fujian is still developing toward full operational maturity. That distinction matters. Commissioning a carrier is one milestone. Building a fully mature carrier air wing and the crews, procedures, and support system around it takes much longer. Even so, the direction is clear. China is expanding its ability to operate naval aviation farther from its own coastline. So it is tempting to put Kaga and Fujian side by side and ask a simple question: which one wins? But that is the wrong comparison. Fujian is a much larger carrier built around a very different model of naval aviation. Kaga is not a smaller Fujian. Japan is not trying to out-Fujian, and comparing the two ships directly misses the point. Japan's approach is not based on matching China's carrier fleet ship for ship. Instead, Kaga and Izumo add another layer to a much broader defense system. That system includes land-based Japanese aircraft, Japan's growing F-35 fleet, destroyers, submarines, surveillance aircraft, ground-based forces, and, critically, allied forces. That last part may matter more than the size of Kaga itself. When Japan tested F-35B operations aboard Kaga in 2024, it did so with American support, and Japan is no longer relying only on allied aircraft to prove the concept. Its own F-35B force is now beginning to take shape. Japan began introducing F-35Bs at New Tabaru Air Base, and plans call for roughly 10 aircraft there during fiscal year 2026 as the force develops toward a new operational unit. That means the story is moving through several stages. First, Japan modified the ships. Then Allied F-35Bs demonstrated that the concept could work. Now Japan is building its own aircraft force to pair with that capability. And Allied interoperability continues to grow. American F-35Bs have operated with Japanese forces. British F-35Bs have also demonstrated operations involving Kaga. Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom have expanded naval and aviation cooperation in the region. That does not mean three countries have created one completely interchangeable carrier air wing. Interoperability should not be exaggerated. But it does mean Japan is developing these ships inside an alliance structure rather than as isolated national platforms. And that changes the way their value should be measured. Kaga's value is not only what sits on its deck, it is also what the ship connects to. The ship is visible. The network around it is the bigger story. That matters even more because aircraft carriers face a very different environment today than they did in 1942. Modern surface ships operate in an era of long-range precision weapons. Anti-ship missiles have become faster, longer-ranged, and increasingly sophisticated. Large ships can be tracked by combinations of aircraft, satellites, ships, and other sensors. So the return of fighters to a Japanese flight deck does not somehow make Kaga invulnerable. Quite the opposite. Any large surface ship operating in contested waters faces serious risk. And a relatively small aviation ship does not suddenly become an American-style supercarrier simply because F-35Bs can use its deck. That is why survivability, flexibility, and integration matter so much. A carrier that operates alone is one thing. A ship operating alongside other naval forces, land-based aviation, and allied assets is something different. That does not remove the threat, but it changes the strategic calculation. And it explains why the important question is not how many aircraft Kaga can carry compared with Fujian. The more useful question is what additional options Kaga gives Japan and its allies. There is another important point. Japan's return to sea-based fighter aviation should not be confused with a return to the naval strategy of Imperial Japan. The symbolism of the name Kaga is impossible to ignore, but the strategic system surrounding the modern ship is fundamentally different. The original Kaga sailed as part of an imperial carrier strike force. The modern Kaga operates inside Japan's post-war security framework. Its F-35B conversion has been publicly described by Japan in terms of strengthening national defense, improving interoperability with the United States, and contributing to deterrence and stability in the Indo-Pacific. That does not make every question disappear. There are still debates inside and outside Japan about military expansion, constitutional interpretation, defense spending, and the country's changing security posture. Those debates matter. But describing the ship simply as evidence that Japan is rebuilding its old carrier navy is too simplistic. Japan is not recreating 1942. It is responding to the security environment of the 2020s. And that environment looks very different. China's naval power is growing. North Korea continues developing missiles. Russia remains militarily active in the region. Japan is increasing defense spending. The United States is reinforcing its alliances across the Indo-Pacific. And military planners throughout the region are thinking about how to keep forces operating even when traditional infrastructure comes under pressure. That is where ships like Kaga become strategically interesting. Not because they are enormous. They are not. Not because they can replace land-based air power. They cannot. And not because Japan is secretly building a fleet of American-style supercarriers. There is no confirmed Japanese program for a larger catapult-equipped carrier that should be treated as established policy. What comes after Izumo and Kaga remains uncertain. Perhaps these ships eventually influence Japan's future debate about naval aviation. Perhaps the current model remains sufficient. Perhaps new technologies change the question entirely. But those are future possibilities. The capability that exists today is already significant enough. Japan has taken ships originally designed around helicopter operations and modified them to support F-35Bs. Kaga has already conducted developmental fighter trials. Japan is introducing its own F-35Bs, and allied interoperability is becoming an increasingly visible part of the concept. That is the transformation we can actually document, and it reveals something broader about modern naval power. The biggest ship is not automatically the most useful answer to every problem. A smaller ship can still create strategic value if it adds flexibility to a larger force. That does not mean smaller is always better. It means the platform has to be judged by the system around it. China's Fujian represents one approach: a large carrier, catapult-launched aircraft, a growing carrier aviation ecosystem. Japan's approach is different. Two converted aviation-capable ships, short takeoff and vertical landing fighters, strong land-based air power, and deep integration with allies. Different ships. Different scale, different strategic logic. Which model proves more useful will depend on circumstances that cannot be answered by displacement numbers alone. And this is why Kaga is more interesting than the phrase mega carrier suggests. If Japan had simply built a giant carrier, the story would be obvious. Instead, Tokyo has created something harder to categorize. Officially, Kaga remains a DDH. Practically, its aviation capability has expanded dramatically. The label stayed familiar. The capability changed. And after 8 decades, fixed-wing fighter aviation is returning to Japanese warships in a form shaped not by the Pacific War, but by the security architecture of the modern Indo-Pacific. The historical contrast is hard to miss. In 1942, the original Kaga went to Midway as part of one of the most powerful carrier forces in the world. It ended up on the bottom of the Pacific. Today, another Kaga sails under the same name, but it belongs to a different navy, a different Japan, a different alliance structure, and a completely different strategic era. Kaga looks like a return to the past. Strategically, it is something new. So here's the bigger question. Does Japan really need larger aircraft carriers, or can ships like Kaga and Izumo deliver more value by operating as part of a wider allied network? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more fact-based stories about military technology, geopolitics, and the forces reshaping the world, subscribe to News Frontier. Because Kaga may look like a return to the past, but what Japan is building around it is something very different.